Good morning. My name is Ken Cook. I'm president of Environmental Working Group, and welcome to this webinar to discuss some very disturbing information that's come to the forefront now relating to the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. We have a distinguished panel of experts to address the question, to remind people alarmed that an electricity shortfall might force California to endure blackouts, which were devastating economically and politically when they've happened in the past. In September of 2022, the California legislature, at Governor Newsom's urging, passed a law that voided an agreement to retire the state's last remaining nuclear power plant at Diablo Canyon in 2025 and replaced that power with renewables. The law directed state regulators to extend Diablo Canyon's operation for 5 years through the end of 2030. The law was passed with no analysis from any state authority or expert on the cost of the extension, among other important questions. A year and a half later, some of the answers are beginning to emerge, and they are very troubling, to say the least. And that's our topic for today. We have three distinguished experts to address these questions. John Giesman is an attorney specializing in energy regulation here in California, former member of the California Energy Commission. He will be explaining PG&E's admission that the new cost to operate Diablo Canyon has been escalated. Peter Bradford, a renowned expert on nuclear policy, former member, among many other positions, of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I believe he was a regulator at the time that Diablo Canyon was approved, and he didn't favor moving forward with Diablo Canyon. He'll be explaining that this new estimate from PG&E doesn't cover costs to update the facility in the ways that so many experts believe are needed to enhance its safety and viability. And finally, Linda Seeley is a spokesperson for Mothers for Peace, one of the leading advocacy organizations that's been raising questions about Diablo Canyon's safety and reliability for many years. And she'll be addressing those topics as we proceed through the panel. So first, let me turn to John Giesman to talk about what he has learned from diving into these dense thickets of regulatory filings that make it very difficult for the public to really understand what's going on. You need someone who dives into the details, and John is one of those people. John?
Thank you, Ken. I represent an organization called the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility in front of the California Public Utilities Commission. We filed a protest against PG&E's cost recovery application. And that protest traces the escalation of cost estimates using PG&E's numbers since 2022. And it's really quite shocking. In 2022, when the legislation passed, PG&E submitted a grant application to the federal government and used that same cost forecast with the Public Utilities Commission last May. That number was $5.2 billion to extend the operation of Diablo Canyon until 2030. Within 60 days in the PUC process last year, PG&E had increased that estimate from $5.2 billion up to $8.1 billion. Now, the PUC ultimately determined that PG&E's cost forecast at $8.1 billion was incomplete and had not included necessary elements of what they will ultimately charge the ratepayers. So the PUC said, you've left us with no basis upon which to determine that going forward will be reasonable, prudent, or cost-effective. The PUC had a statutory deadline, so they extended the retirement dates, but they said, we want you, PG&E, to come back in 2024, no later than March 29th, with a complete forecast, one that includes every dollar that you contemplate charging the ratepayers between now and the end of the extended operation period in 2030. PG&E made that filing. We've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb, and it amounts to $11.8 billion. That's more than a doubling from the number that was used in 2022 to persuade the governor and the legislature to go forward with the extension. And let me put that in a slightly different context. In 2022, the governor's office told the legislature that they were expecting it to cost about $75 a megawatt hour. PG&E's current forecast, using the $11.8 billion sum, works out to about $130 a megawatt hour, a rough doubling. Now, this plant has had above market costs for a long time. PG&E's grant application in 2022 acknowledged more than $2.1 billion in above market costs in the 5 years before they submitted the grant. Their current forecast indicates in the next 5 years, during the extended operation period, they expect above market costs more than $4.1 billion. The Public Utilities Commission in May of this year issued a report, they're required to do so every year, on performance under the state's renewable portfolio standard. And they indicated that new contracts signed for renewable projects in 2023 had come in at $58 a megawatt hour. Contracts signed in 2022 were at $62 a megawatt hour. So Diablo Canyon, using PG&E's own numbers, is more than double the cost of these renewable projects, according to the Public Utilities Commission. Now, why is this plant so expensive? You can see that in PG&E's cost recovery application. Now, they prefer to parcel things out. They very much resist giving you a look at the entire cost stream to 2030. So they've only requested recovery of the first year. They call that test year 2025, and they're asking for a little more than $1 billion. In fact, it's $1,030,485,432. Of that $1 billion, they identify $497 million in what they call statutory fees. Those are the inducements that the legislature and the governor had to provide PG&E in order to get them to extend operation of the plant. If you recall, in 2022, a great concern about keeping the lights on. Would we need additional power for reliability purposes? And my client's going to take a backseat to nobody in terms of the importance of keeping the lights on. But the Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, again, in a May 2024 report, indicated that the Newsom administration has done a pretty good job of bringing new resources on. 18,800 megawatts of net qualifying capacity are expected to come online between 2020 and 2028. The joint report of the two agencies indicated that the Commission's preferred system plan meets the reliability standard through 2035. It also indicated that more than 8,000 megawatts of net qualifying capacity were online by the end of 2023. Now remember, Diablo Canyon is worth about 2,240 megawatts. What the Public Utilities Commission and the Energy Commission report is indicating is that resources more than 3 times that amount were online by the end of the year last year. In fact, the report identifies additional analysis performed by the Energy Commission with this comment, the state remains reliable even under extreme scenarios. So the question is, and the state agencies are going to have to resolve this this year. Is there a better way to spend $11.8 billion? Would you buy twice as much in the way of reliability benefits or twice as much in the way of climate benefits if you directed those dollars toward renewable projects rather than propping up an old nuclear plant that is surrounded by earthquake faults? I'll pass it back to you, Ken. And thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Again, the answers to questions that were asked in 2022 are now starting to come out. They are very disturbing. Of course, PG&E has a reputation for uncontrolled spending, and I think our concern is this is but the latest example. Let me turn now to Peter Bradford for his perspective, which is national in scope, but also he's been directly and deeply involved in analysis of Diablo Canyon.
Thanks, Ken. As you said, I've served a term on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and during that time, we licensed more reactors than the NRC has done in any comparable period since. I've also chaired the New York and Maine Utility Regulatory Commissions during times when those states debated and resolved the continued operation of problem nuclear power plants. In California, the testimony I filed before the PUC last year on behalf of San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace contended that the decisions to extend and to pay for the continued operation of Diablo Canyon were being made imprudently, as that term is widely understood in the context of electric power supply policymaking. The rate of increase in the Diablo Canyon extension cost estimates that John has pointed out, with their unfortunate customer and ratepayer implications, is exactly the consequence that one would expect from imprudent power supply decision-making. Recall how rushed the decision-making has been. A midnight legislative amendment without hearings and without PG&E, the company with power supply responsibility, even having said that it needed Diablo Canyon, to say nothing of having provided justification for extending its life. On top of that, a one-sided law that foreclosed meaningful evaluation and testing of the full range of low-carbon options. And on top of that, near total failure to take into account the uncertainties that are always present in nuclear cost estimates. And now, sure enough, those uncertainties are coming home to roost. This type of imprudence in nuclear power planning has contributed to a pattern of multi-billion-dollar cost overruns at nuclear power facilities both operating and under construction, without parallel elsewhere in U.S. industrial history. Just in the last 5 years, we've seen it in Georgia with a $20 billion cost overrun, in Utah with the cancellation of a much ballyhooed small modular reactor project in which the Department of Energy had made a multi-billion-dollar commitment, in Illinois with the jailing of industry and state officials over tactics used to produce legislative support for a few operating reactors, in South Carolina, where criminal activity led also to jail sentences, but also to government support for a nuclear project that was ultimately canceled, leaving a $9 billion hole in the ground. And sadly, also in Ohio, where the corrupt pursuit of subsidies for operating reactors has led to criminal convictions for legislators and the suicide of the former chair of the Utilities Commission. In the swirl of controversial and difficult choices that go with budget shortfalls, it's hard to focus for long on any one topic. However, the implications of the situation that Mr. Giesman has brought to light, especially understood in the context of other recent U.S. experience, are really serious beyond just the present increases. Other safety issues have cost implications for Diablo Canyon that are not in these projections, even the latest ones. If these seismic and reactor integrity concerns need fixing, more large increases can be expected. The doubling of a large cost estimate in less than a year is all too common in the nuclear power industry, and it's usually a sign of more large increases to come. By the time the process is over, customers and taxpayers will have paid a bill that would never have been approved if it had been candidly stated at the outset. The approval comes about through essentially salami tactics, in which the cost increases are divided into small amounts. And the argument is always, yes, it's unfortunate. We wish we'd known this at the outset, but it won't cost that much more to go forward. To make matters worse, other cheaper low-carbon electricity sources will have been crowded out in favor of a nuclear plant that must be run in order to recover its excessive costs. The California legislature was wise enough to write off-ramps into the legislation, paving the way for extended Diablo Canyon operation. Nothing cries out off-ramp more loudly than the doubling of a multi-billion-dollar cost estimate in a little more than a year's time.
Peter, thank you so much. I think the picture that's emerging is a chronic record of vast cost underestimates by the nuclear industry, on top of public questions about the ability of PG&E to frankly state the costs for any of its operations and seek recovery of those, including recovery from the enormous costs, human and economic, it has created through the massive wildfires started by its failure to maintain its equipment. So you have sort of a combination of two highly dubious sources of information to rest our future spending as ratepayers in California on, and that should be troubling for everybody. By the way, if PG&E has a different set of numbers, be great to see them. But from my standpoint, I think what John has done is dug out in detail and reinforced by Peter's observations about this pattern in the nuclear industry, a very troubling picture. We should have had these answers 2 years ago, but as Peter says, maybe bill wouldn't have gone forward if we had. Now we're going to hear from Linda Seeley with San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace, at the forefront for many years of raising important questions about the operations and safety of Diablo Canyon. Linda, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you for inviting us to be here. Mothers for Peace, San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace, has been the watchdog group over the safety at Diablo Canyon for 50 plus years now. We pursue all the legal paths that are available to us to point out and to challenge the safety issues at Diablo. Paramount in the safety issues right now, environmental issues too, I'll say. Paramount, though, in the safety issues are first of all, what was mentioned before about the earthquake faults that Diablo lies directly on top of. Our distinguished expert, Dr. Peter Bird, Professor Emeritus at UCLA, has written a paper about the new analysis of the faults that run directly under Diablo Canyon. Turns out that those faults are not lateral faults that go sideways like this. They turn out to be vertical thrust faults that if there were an earthquake, they would go up. What happens if you have a vertical thrust fault that hits a building above it is that it causes a tremendous amount of damage to that building. And that damage just happens to be where the reactor vessels are located. The reactor pressure vessel of Unit 1 is embrittled. What that means is that, say there is an earthquake at Diablo Canyon, the vertical thrust fault causes a higher than expected movement to the critical backup safety systems at Diablo Canyon. They have to, The plant has to shut down fast. In order to shut it down fast, the way they do that is they pour cold water into the reactor vessel, which is under a tremendous amount of pressure, number one, very hot, number two, and number three, unbelievably radioactive. The pressure vessel for Unit 1 has not been tested since 2003, although they are under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They are supposed to test it every 10 years. They have wriggled out of that regulation in various ways. We don't have time to go through it, but I'll be glad to take questions about it. And what would happen if they had to pour cold water into it during an emergency shutdown is that it could very likely shatter. If it shattered, it could cause a catastrophic release of radiation into California. We've heard about the cost of Diablo Canyon. We've heard from John, we don't need Diablo Canyon's power because we have plenty of renewables to replace it. And now we've heard about the danger of the Unit 1 reactor vessel, along with the PG&E's unanalyzed earthquake assessment. And it is patently apparent that this is a really bad idea to throw all this money into an aged, dangerous nuclear power plant. I want to say the other important issue to Mothers for Peace is the once-through cooling at Diablo Canyon that people have kind of brushed under the carpet lately. The Diablo Canyon sucks in 2.5 billion gallons of water through it every day and discharges it back into the Pacific Ocean, 19 degrees warmer than it was when it came in. During that process, every single bit of life, which includes billions and billions of larvae of sea life, are killed. Plus, the heat from the nuclear reaction goes into the atmosphere constantly, warming our atmosphere. So this is another one of those issues that doesn't get a lot of attention, but is extraordinarily important. With that, I'll stop and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Linda. And I think as Peter underscored, any additional improvements that would be needed to safeguard against the issues that you raised, Linda, and others, that's not included in this $11.8 billion, I believe is the case. No. So the price could go even higher. I'm going to turn now to the questions. First, I'll ask John or Peter, do you have anything to add to one another's comments, or can we jump right in?
Let's go to questions.
Okay. Noah Haggerty at the LA Times. He says, many energy experts say some level of, quote, base power will be needed in an energy grid with 100% renewables. That's not at the whim of variations in wind gusts and sunshine. Do you think this is true? Should nuclear hold a future in California's energy portfolio?
Well, go ahead, Peter.
Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, under state law that has been in effect since 1976, a new nuclear project would not be permitted in California until the federal government has demonstrated a commercially viable way to provide for permanent storage of nuclear waste. And over the course of the last 48 years, the federal government has not been able to establish that standard. A lot of people think that we've made virtually no progress on that front. So I don't think within the state a new project is likely. Frankly, I think for those that do believe that there's a role for nuclear power, it would make a lot more sense to invest incremental dollars in trying to explore new technologies than prop up a plant that is a 1960s design and has already lasted for its expected design life. So the baseload question, at least in terms of Diablo Canyon, is best seen as a reliability question. Reliability planners are trying to address 600 hours a year, generally afternoons and evenings in 4 summer months. Diablo Canyon is designed to operate about 7,800 hours a year. That's 90% capacity factor. And you got to ask yourself, if you're operating at 2 times market costs, and you've got to run because of your technology design all of the time, you're either all on or all off, and you're only trying to address a reliability issue that could come up within 600 hours, less than a tenth of your operating period, how did the economics of that make any sense? And I think the response that the market has produced here in California, with a great deal of nurturing from the Newsom administration, has been battery storage combined with solar power plants. And from a reliability standard perspective, that's a much better solution.
That I think is certainly right. And it's part of a picture in which the term baseload power supply is evolving around the country. It just doesn't mean what it meant, say, 20 years ago, when people would think of it in terms of the big coal, oil, nuclear plants that were on a good part of the time. The idea of baseload power now is, yes, you need reliability 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but there are a lot of ways to get it that are new to the industry. Batteries are certainly a big part of that, but so is controllable load, so that you can shift load around to meet when power supplies are available. So is the expansion and increased computerization of transmission systems, so that you can move power that's surplus in some areas into the places you need it more efficiently than we've been able to in the past. And so you can get baseload power, it's sometimes called virtual power plants, out of packages of improvements to the power system that give you every bit as reliable, a less costly, and less environmentally damaging system than the old system that was based on the baseload coming from the big plants. Because, as John says, if you make that commitment to the big plants, especially nuclear, you've got to run them. They can't recover their costs unless they run all the time. And that means they're not just running in the times when you need them, but you're having to run them when you don't need them, when you have a surplus of solar. But nuclear energy is a lot more costly than the solar energy that it's forcing out.
Great, thank you. I have a question here from Audie McAfee. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from KPFA Radio. What will be the next step if PG&E doesn't pivot? I suppose that means if PG&E doesn't go in a different direction to provide power other than through extension of Diablo Canyon. What's the implication of that?
Well, the Public Utilities Commission needs to rule this year on this first test year 25 recovery of rates. So they'll have a decision to make, a little more than $1 billion passed through to every ratepayer within the PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric system. And about half of that $1 billion will be directed toward these various sweeteners that the legislature and the governor had to put into the law in order to get PG&E to go forward.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
One very important measure that the California Commission might consider, we did it in New York with regard to a situation where nuclear costs were running away, is the imposing of a hard cap on just how much was going to be allowable. And usually you'd look at the cost of alternatives as well as the cost estimates that you were originally furnished in making the commitment to the plant in order to set that cap. That way, if the expenditures do run away above the cap, it's not the customers and the taxpayers who are exposed. It's the utility shareholders, which is really the way the historic process of building power plants worked. You financed and put them in the rate base and collected a return, and the shareholders benefited. That way, the shareholders are the ones with the stakes in managing the costs. The system as the Diablo Canyon now has created what's called a kind of a moral hazard situation, in that the people in charge of managing the plants really aren't the ones exposed to the consequences of the cost overruns. They're pointed towards federal taxpayers, state taxpayers, California ratepayers from the southern tip of the state to the northern end, because under the unique California system, these costs flow to Southern California, Edison, and San Diego as well. So right now, the costs and the responsibility for controlling the costs are not in the same place.
And just to make sure I'm clear on this, people all over the state who won't receive a single electron of power from this nuclear plant as it's extended at whatever cost, 11.8 billion, maybe it's higher. They'll be paying additional fees on their electric bill, even though they're not served directly by Diablo Canyon.
Yeah, I've never seen in any place that I've regulated or consulted in an arrangement like the one California set up for charging Diablo to the customers of regulated utilities who don't get any power from it.
Yeah, and what a concept of having the folks who own PG&E and who had $2.2 billion in profits last year, record profit, 25% increase over the year before. What a concept to have them pick up the tab for these cost overruns instead of ratepayers and taxpayers. Bradley Zeev from Montgomery County now asks, what percent of California's current electrical energy needs are provided by Diablo Canyon? And with approved projects, how does that percentage change in the next 5 years? I guess the balance that's anticipated with the renewables coming on. Anyone want to tackle that one?
Based on the forecast from a couple of years ago, electricity demand, Diablo Canyon represents about 9% of the state's electricity. One of the things that factors into the decision.
Oh, it's like John's connection is a little frozen there. We'll come back to him if he thaws out. I hope no one will see this.
To be a pretty strong consensus that demand is going up, certainly after 2030, because of building electrification and the move to electric vehicles. But the Energy Commission has actually revised its forecast between now and 2030 downward. And the reason for that is that up until about 6 months ago, the projections for population growth and economic growth tied to population growth in California were substantially larger than the new statistics on demographics coming out of the Department of Finance. So the Energy Commission has revised its demand forecast down between now and 2030. So I don't know what percentage that will result in Diablo representing, perhaps a little bit more than 9%.
We have a question from Michael Blood at Associated Press. How do you envision the legislature backing out of the agreement? What off-ramp from the Senate Bill 846 could be taken at this point? And there is an off-ramp that's provided for that in that legislation. What's your thought?
Well, I think that the first step appears to be underway, at least in the budget process this year. Both subcommittees, the Assembly Subcommittee and the Senate Subcommittee, and now the full Senate Committee, have removed from the budget the proposed augmentation of the Diablo Canyon loan of $400 million. I think they concluded that with the budget situation so tight, the last thing in the world they wanted to do was to stuff more money into PG&E's pockets. And it's particularly noteworthy that the loan authorized in 2022 from the State General Fund was for $1.4 billion. It was supposed to be matched off against a federal grant of $1.1 billion, but PG&E never applied for the full offsetting amount. There's always been a $300 million gap. So I think the legislature has started to try to correct those. It built into the law a number of off-ramps that the Public Utilities Commission or the State Energy Commission or the Department of Water Resources that are supposed to monitor the loan can trigger. And they're generally off-ramps based on cost effectiveness and the sufficiency of renewable resources to meet the needs that Diablo otherwise would be meeting.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go
as
ahead.
John indicated in his opening statement, the PUC explicitly deferred into the next phase of its proceeding the findings that it's required to make as to whether this arrangement is cost effective and prudent. So if it concludes that it isn't, that prudence finding is tied, among other things, directly to the loan agreement. If the PUC were ever to say this is not cost effective and prudent, the loan agreement itself would probably might well be invalidated.
Well, I would just add as an additional point, it would be great if a legislative committee really dug into this question and asked, what is this extension actually going to cost? I don't think anyone's comfortable taking PG&E's word for it. And meaning no offense, of course, it doesn't seem like the Public Utility Commission has the necessarily the investigative rigor applied here that would necessarily reveal what the full cost might be too. So additional independent investigation, I think, would be welcome. A question from Serena Grossi from KCBX. She asks, can you clarify how the $11.8 billion ask from PG&E would impact California ratepayers?
I think that the only calculation that PG&E has made for that relates to the first test year 2025 recovery of the $1 billion that they've requested. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that it's about $1 a month in the PG&E service territory and about half of that in the Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric service territories. I'd emphasize that's for that first test year, and that is not a proportionate amount of the full extended operating period. The first test year includes 2024 and 2025, when much of the plant will have been paid for by a prior general rate case decision. So it's not a full picture. My hunch is it's no more than about half of what the ultimate run rate will average going forward for test year 2026 through test year 2030.
Okay, we have another question here from Julie Small from KQED. Julie asks, how confident are you in the California Public Utility Commission's ability to analyze and assess the risks and costs of bringing Diablo or keeping Diablo online? And do you have a sense of when the CPUC will make decisions about these matters?
That is a terrific question, and it's a little bit awkward personally. I have been a critic of the Public Utilities Commission since I was the executive director of the State Energy Commission in the 1970s. But I will tell you, I think I probably have more confidence in their ability, both at the commissioner level and among the staff, in order to sort this out than most people you're going to run into. I don't think the problem is likely to be a lack of analytic capability on the part of the commission. They will likely have to make a decision, at least on this first year, by the end of calendar year 2024. Hopefully, they'll make a decision based on the full extension period. But PG&E has emphasized all they're seeking is recovery of the first year's costs. They're not asking for anything more than that. As Peter indicated, this is the salami approach to the utility business. Just show them a little piece at a time. But I think the Public Utilities Commission is able to get to the bottom of this.
Yeah, I as a former PUC chair in other states, I have looked at that question from both sides now, and there, I'm sure, are a lot of good people, including commissioners on that commission. And if they're free to take an independent and thorough look, I don't doubt that they can do it. At the same time, there are, in all regulatory situations, huge resource questions. I mean, the resources really are very heavily on the side of the utilities. And that's why one looks also for regulatory techniques that don't require a high degree of perfect prophecy from the regulatory agencies, because you got to know you're not going to get that. It just can't. And in particular, in a situation like this, one would like at some point to be able to require that Diablo Canyon's next 5 years have to compete against all other available resources in a fully open auction process, with all the costs on the table for all of those resources. That doesn't require the regulators to be prophets. It just requires them to design effective market mechanisms. By and large, nuclear power avoids those kinds of competitions because they don't win them.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have from the reporters on the call. I want to thank all of them for joining and thank all of our panelists for your expertise and your clear explanations. We will look forward to seeing just how this pans out. I find myself hoping that at some point, these kinds of costs that PG&E commonly brings to us will be brought under control. I think we're seeing growing concern in the legislature. There's certainly growing concern in the public amongst ratepayers for the constantly escalating costs of electricity in the state and spending that seems to be out of control. Let's hope this is not an example, that the CPUC doesn't move forward and assume that because the legislature said so, we'll spend whatever it takes. Hope that's not going to be the case. But $11.8 billion, the number that's been discovered by John Giesman in these regulatory filings, is a matter that should concern everyone in California. And we hope that something will be done soon to make sure we have more clarity at minimum for what we're on the hook for. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. And if you have follow-ups, please contact Iris Meyer, who's our communications lead on this call. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.